Alrighty, I guess we'll get started. So, brewing beer with rice. I know a lot of you all probably have seen, rice is used as an adjunct to go with most beers, and the infamous large brewer Anheuser-Busch uses rice in their both Budweiser and Bud Light, and they use it purposefully for the one thing that rice was originally used for, and that was to basically add fermentable sugars, but not adding body to the beer. So that's kind of the fun thing about rice, is that it really does not have any sort of, in addition to body to the beer, it just simply adds fermentable sugars. But we're going to get into detail how you get to those fermentable sugars, because it's not as readily available as it is in barley and other adjuncts. So I started trying to brew with rice about a year and change ago. It was more so when I was in the middle of going through nursing school and studying for 8 to 12 hours at a time, that I thought, I could utilize this time by doing two things at once. So while I was studying in my office, I was actually had rice or beer mashing in the kitchen, and I'd let it go for like 8 or 10 hours, not really knowing about the cereal mash process and a lot of those other things. So I was honestly flying by the seat of my pants when I started doing this. So it was kind of fun, but I've learned quite a bit since I started brewing beer with rice. So what is rice? Well, rice is one of the most consumed grains in the entire world. The majority of the world, of course, us Americans, we're a little spoiled, and we have a lot more proteins available to us, but the rest of the world utilizes rice in a lot of different ways. Primarily, they use it for filler, because that's what it's used for, because they don't have tons of protein to go with their food, so they use rice. So rice is primarily composed of carbohydrates, but 80% of its dry weight is carbohydrates. And of course, most of the carbohydrate in rice is starch. We all love starch, it's in everything, and the most common carbohydrate in foods, and that's why we love it. And it's made of these long chains of glucose called amylose and amylopectin. Those are your primary starch compounds that are found in rice. Unfortunately, those do not work well with your normal yeast that we use in brewing. So we got to get to that sugar in a different way. We kind of got to get around that. But that's what makes brewing with rice a little challenging. So interestingly enough, the picture that I have on the left there, that is actually in Arkansas. That is at the Anheuser-Busch farms that they have in Arkansas, and that's actually where they grow all the rice for all their beers. So Anheuser-Busch has a contract with a bunch of, they own like thousands of acres in Arkansas, in the middle of absolute nowhere, Arkansas, and that's where they grow their rice. And rice is grown all over Asia mostly, but believe it or not, Arkansas apparently is a really preferable place for growing rice. And you can see in the other picture, that's what rice looks like when it's still being grown, or what it just looks like a normal cereal grain hanging out on the vine, right, or on the stem of the stalk. And it's usually done in those large fields with water in the base of it. And so apparently it's really, really dangerous too, because there's a lot of water moccasins that hang out in those fields. So something to be leery about when farming for rice. So here's the cool part about rice, is that honestly you are only limited by your imagination, because there's 120,000 different varieties of rice out there. One of the beers you're going to have tonight, I went down to H Mart in Mira Mesa to get, because I can't get it anywhere up here, but if you go down their aisle there where they have all the rice, it is overwhelming, because they have so many different varieties of rice. One beer that I brew that some of may or may not have been here, I did the Forbidden Rice Lager. Some of you may or may not have had that one. That was where I used black rice, not wild rice, but black rice. And black rice was always known as the forbidden rice, because it was basically set aside for the emperor. And so that's why it was known as the forbidden rice. Well, that rice, when I started cooking it, got me a little nervous, because it was really, really earthy smelling. and the whole house kind of smelled like dirt. My wife loved it. But I was like, oh, what is this going to do to this beer? How is this going to turn out? And if some of you got to experience, it was amazing because it created this little bit of color, not a ton of color, but it created this awesome nutty flavor that I had never really gotten from most of our barley malts that I was able to impart using that black rice in the beer. And then moving on to Asia, like we were talking about, there's over, where most of this started, there's over 40,000 different kinds of rice in Asia alone. And so if any of you have traveled abroad, you know, there was rice that I had in Afghanistan which was very, very different than the rice that I had when I was in Japan or when I was in South Korea or when I was in Indonesia or even when I was in Sri Lanka. All these different places, the rice is very, very different no matter where you go. And so they're broken into these 4 categories, but the 2 main categories are your short grain and your long grain rice. Those are your primary rice categories that you're going to see out there. Now, if you're just looking for sugar content and just trying to get as much fermentable sugars out of it, go with the short grain rice. So if you want to, thin out a beer and just add a bunch of sugar, my recommendation would be see if you can find some sort of sushi rice or short grain rice. There's also known as the Creros rice. You'll find that at Walmart. It's like $5 for 5 pounds. I've used that a couple times now. It's very clean, easy to use, and we'll get into how you get to the sugar in it. But it's very, very simple to use, and it's cheap. And since everything costs way more than it should anymore, it's a nice way to save a little money on your grains as well. So most often, though, in brewing, the primary use of rice is flaked rice. And it's usually done in, you can get it in most homebrew shops, you can get it on Amazon or whatever other big box retailer you want to go through. But flaked rice is pretty one-dimensional, and that's the unfortunate part about using flaked rice, is that it just simply thins out the beer. It's really great for using it in lagers. Highly recommended if you're trying to just make a really nice light lager, use 20 to 30% flaked rice in your grist, and you will get a really nice, light, clean, easy-drinking beer that is pretty simple to do. You don't have to do anything crazy with it. You don't have to do a cereal mash. You just can add that to your mash and go do like you normally do with your brewing. But flake rice is what you'll find in most brew shops. But the difference, though, is most flake rice is I think it's like $2.50 or $3 a pound is what I'm seeing in most places. So, I mean, I know it's not a lot if you're only using like a couple pounds, but it all adds up, and you can save quite a bit of money by simply using the real rice in your beer. So flaked rice is kind of cool because I did not know this, but a beer that some may have already tried a little of, and we're going to try in a minute, Harlan Brewing, their Japanese rice lager, they use a flaked rice, but what they do is they actually toast their rice, kind of like you can toast your oats for like a oatmeal stout. They actually toast their rice flakes, and they use that in their beer, and that adds a little bit of a nuance, little roastiness to it. But I actually watched this video on YouTube, and they actually take the rice, they cook the rice, and then they put it on this long belt, and they have this giant roller, and it just squishes the rice completely flat, and then it goes through this oven, and it dries it out completely, and then it breaks it up into little tiny flakes, and that's what we use for flaked rice when we brew with it. So that's actually how they make that. But like I said, it can be added to the mash. You can mash it with your 150 to 154 degrees Fahrenheit, like you normally would with most beers, and it's fairly simple. It usually, unless you're going crazy with the rice, like I sometimes will do, I'll do like 40%, which one of the beers we're doing tonight is 40% rice. But usually you don't have to add rice hulls, but it doesn't hurt to add rice hulls, and I'll reiterate that. Rice hulls are your friend when brewing with rice because you will see stuck mashes and stuck sparges because they kind of can become a gelatinized goo, and that will happen a lot. So the next slide we're going to talk about is the Harlan Brewing's Japanese rice lager. So Andy always likes the origins, or what was the inspiration behind this whole thing of brewing with rice. And this is the beverage that started it. There is a sushi place in Encinitas called Sushi Lounge, and they have this beer on tap, and I always have had this with my sushi there, but this is the one that they have, and this is their Japanese rice lager, and which got me thinking, I should try brewing with rice. I wonder how hard it is to brew beer with rice, because it's a really delicious beer. It's super easy drinking, and the fun part is Harlan Brewing is actually here in San Diego. And it's kind of fun thing is on all their cans, you can see it'll actually have the zip code, and it'll show where it was brewed and all that. And it's just kind of their little shtick of how they do their beer. So the grist for this one is pretty interesting. It's Pilsner malt. Then they do puffed jasmine rice, which we haven't talked about yet, but puffed rice is kind of like think like Sugar Smacks, that kind of thing, that cereal, that breakfast cereal. That's what that is it's a puffed rice. So they've already kind of brought those sugars available for you to be consumed that way by puffing the rice, and they use jasmine rice in theirs, which, so I don't know if you can tell, but if you really you can kind of get a little bit of sense of, you know how jasmine rice will sometimes have a little bit of that perfumey kind of note to it. I get a little bit of that in that, and that kind of comes out in that, and that's just one of the nuances that you can get with this specific rice. Like I was saying with the black rice that caused that little nutty flavor that kind of come out in the beer, you can use like jasmine rice to get you a little bit of perfumey kind of flavor. It just all depends on, honestly, there's red rice, which is the next one I'm going to try to brew a beer with, which I haven't played with yet, but we're going to see what that one does. And then I mentioned this earlier, they toast their flaked rice. So they toast their flaked rice to a golden color, and that's where you get a little bit of that roasted flavor. Even though you see the beer is super light in color, super clear, they roast it so you get a little bit more of a flavor profile, but it doesn't really add any of the body to it, and doesn't really add any color to the beer, which is kind of the fun part about it. So moving into the whole Japanese lagers, we're going to get into a little bit of a whole background in Japanese. I actually was stationed in mainland Japan from 2005 to 2007 at the Naval Hospital there. And then I also deployed to Okinawa, Japan, which we're going to drink a beer from Okinawa today, a little later. And I got to try this beer, and luckily I was drinking age at the time. I was 20 years old on that deployment, and 20 is the drinking age in Japan, so I just screwed it in there. But Japanese style rice lagers are primarily contain rice to supplement the malt. Usually up to a third of the grain bill is made with rice. And it makes sense, though, and I was reading some of the history behind it, because in Japan, they were able to get a lot of the malt there, but they had tons of rice available to them. So they're like, well, we could kind of, extend out our product by adding rice to it, and that's when they started doing that. But they started using it with traditional European hops, because most of the time they were using things like Hallertau or Tettnang, and one of the beers I'll be serving tonight, I used Hallertau hops in it just to produce their traditional English characteristics or noble hop characteristics. And sometimes I read some use a citrusy hop. I haven't seen that, but then again, that's on my to-do list to do a rice IPA with probably like Citra hops. Just because I know cold IPAs are kind of all the semi-rage right now, so I figured that this would be kind of a fun way to skirt into there, is try to do like a rice IPA next. So stay tuned, there will be coming to club. They use lager yeast, obviously, but you can probably get away with probably like California ale yeast. You probably could get away with using, especially if I do the IPA. I'll probably try it with the California ale yeast just to see what happens. And you all will be my guinea pigs, so it'll be fun. They're usually pale color, straw color, so they fall into the BJCP of the International Pale Lager, but it doesn't. It's kind of a category on its own, but it falls under the International Pale Lager category. Pale to golden. So when we do the Orion beer a little bit later, that one is more of the darker golden color. So usually they have a very, very soft bitterness, so the IBUs are usually between 15 to 30 IBUs is what most of them I've seen have. Some of them were a little bit higher, but they're usually very dry, very attenuated because of the rice. Tends to, like the one that I made, finished at 10:06 for the final gravity, and they're very dry, they're very easy drinking, great for the summertime. I don't think I was thinking well enough ahead that it was going to be cold in March. This probably would have been a better presentation for like June or July, but it'll be all right. And then they have that nice crisp mouthfeel that you got from that beer, and it just makes you want to have another sip after your first sip. It's one thing I really like about brewing with those beers. Usually they're fairly highly carbonated. I usually do them to 2.5 to 3 parts or 3 volumes of CO2, depending on what the style is and how much I'm trying to go with the thing. But they usually, like Sapporo up there, I don't know if you all know this, but they recently bought out, they're the company that bought out Stone. And they're actually a fairly old company, and they've been around since 1860s. So their introduction to beer really came from the Europeans in the 1600s when they started coming over. But it wasn't until the 1800s that they really started doing the breweries over there in Japan. And they used German and Dutch brewing methods. That's who they learned from. And they were able to create lighter, crisper beers by adding rice to it. And I just thought that it was funny that there's so many times in history that beer has been shaped by taxes. And this is another situation where the history of this whole entire thing was shaped by taxes because taxes were based upon how much malt they used in the beer. They were able to save on the taxes they had to pay to the government by using the rice as a supplement in the beer. So it's all about how much taxes they have to pay. So unfortunately, that's just how life is. So the next beer, if you could get that queued up, is the one that I wanted you all to try. That is the Orion beer. This is the beverage that I got to try when I was deployed to Okinawa on a regular deployment in 2002, so a couple years ago. But the cool part is that this is fairly unique because it's kind of hard to get around here. I had to go, like I said, I had to go all the way down to Mira Mesa to get this beer. It's a little bit more golden in color. And it's kind of fun to find, but if you find it, I highly recommend you get it. So interesting parts about this beer that I found was really cool was that if you know anything about Okinawa, Japan, it is a tropical island. It's located, I don't know how many hundreds of miles south of mainland Japan, but it was one of the main islands in the island campaign during World War II. It's a triple canopy jungle because I remember that because I got to survive off the land for a week out there. Lots of snakes. And the cool part is that they really, really try to utilize all the aspects of the island. So they use the water that comes from the jungle and through the mountains right by the brewery in their water, and they use that specific profile for their beer. And then they also, going back to tradition, they use German and Czech hops, going back to their traditions and that, and then they use the rice that is grown specifically in Okinawa, Japan. So if you ever see this on tap in any of the sushi restaurants out here, I highly recommend you try it out. It's really, really great, really enjoyable, but it's just kind of a unique beer, and sometimes I think there's been some issues with the import-export situation because I used to be able to find it at Bevmo sometimes and some other places, and a lot of them are no longer carrying it. So if you see it, grab it, or grab a pint of it if you get a chance to, because I think it's really, really good, especially with like spicy tuna roll. It's one of my favorites with this one. And then they also, I think they had this one roll called the Diablo roll, which had, I think it had some ghost pepper chili sauce on it, and you definitely need something to cool it down. So this definitely helps with that. But really, really great with spicy foods, really, really fun with that sort of thing. So getting into the whole, now that I've talked a lot about the Japanese lagers and also the rice lagers and all that, we're going to get into actually brewing beer with rice. So it actually has the largest starch content of all cereal grains, but once it converted, high as 90% of it is convertible to fermentability. But first we need to break down those starches to convert them for brewing. So the question is, how do I get to all that goodness? And that is the cereal mash. Anybody here done a cereal mash? It's a little bit of work, but I feel like it's worth it. So what's that? It's kind of one of those things where you don't do too often. It's kind of like one of those old school things, but it really does bring out some interesting flavors. So most raw grains, they got their starches and their granules, and you can't soak it. Even if you were to soak it for hours on end, it really won't come out. So there's a certain range that you need to heat the mash up, or the rice up to, in order to convert those sugars, as is with barley, allowing those enzymes to later access those starches. So the temperature range is known as the gelatin range or the gelatinization range, and that's what we're trying to do. But keep in mind that word gelatinization, because that's what you're going to get. This is why I said rice hulls is your friend. It becomes a gelatinous goo. It's delicious goo, but it can cause everything to clog up in your setup, depending on what you have. But if you don't have a brew in the bag setup, this is one of those times where you may want to use a brew in the bag setup if you don't have a good setup. But usually, temperature range all depends from 120 to 140 degrees Celsius, or 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or 50 to 60 degrees C, but it's a little different with rice. So just for your information, if you are to use any of the unmalted cereal grains out there, these are your temperatures for the conversions of gelatinization. So if you're, like I've done this one beer a few times where I called it the Magic Grits Lager, where I just used corn grits in it. I actually didn't even follow this. I just put it in with the rest of it, but it did convert because it was within that range. Rice, on the other hand, has to be between 154 to 172 degrees in order to cause the gelatinization. So what does all that mean? Well, we're going to get to how to actually do the cereal mash. So the ratio that I tend to do is I'll mix the water, roughly a 5-to-1 ratio with water and barley. So usually if I'm going to do, say, a pound of rice, I can use, 0.2 pounds of barley, or 5 pounds of rice, 1 pound of barley on your stove separately. So I will actually do this at the same time while I'm heating up my strike water. So I will, while I'm heating up my setup and getting the rest of my brew setup day going, I will in the kitchen have another pot going with the rice that I can add to the beer after that. And that usually has worked out fairly well most of the time. So you're going to heat the mixture to 154 to 171 degrees, slowly stirring it, and rest it for 20 minutes. And that's what's going to cause the gelatinization, cause a bit of the goo to be created. And here's another thing is that I thought I put this on here. I could be wrong because I just knew it. I usually do 2 quarts per pound of water. So 2 quarts of water per every pound of rice that when I'm doing this part of the mash. So you need a fairly large pot, because it's going to be kind of a very loose mixture when you start heating it up. But as the gelatinization starts happening and all the starches get converted, it becomes a gelatinized goo that absorbs a lot of the water. Yes? What's that? Oh.
What's the purpose of mixing malt in
So
with
the
the
purpose
rice?
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
We're going to get to that. But sure, no, you're fine. I was going to talk about that. So the purpose of adding malt to the rice is that the malt or the malted barley has been malted, and because it's been malted, it has those the amylase enzyme already on it, and so by adding the barley to it, it helps convert that starch to sugar. You can add the amylase enzyme directly to the rice as well. I have not done that because I was worried about it drying out the beer too much. Because I was thinking about doing one beer that way, but I saw that it doesn't denature until you get to like 230 degrees, and I'm not going to do it in a pressure cooker, so I didn't want to use that, but apparently some people will use the enzyme with it to convert the sugars and not have to use barley, but you add the barley, so the barley converts the starches to fermentable sugars. Yes?
So you're going to add that gelatinized rice later to the main mash, right?
Yes.
Which is where you would expect that conversion to happen. So why are you adding barley early on to start converting in that process?
It's to fully convert all the starches out. You'll get some I've done both ways, and I get a lot more efficiency this method. You can get some efficiency you can just heat the rice up, turn it into the goo, and dump it into your mash, and then let the barley do it. But it's going to add another hour plus to your brew day, which you can do. It's an option, and I have done it before. But if you do this simultaneously, it speeds things up because I'll talk about it in the next slide. But I use this as my skipping the mash out step because I'll add this goo to the main mash tun, and it brings the temperature from 150 or so degrees to 170, 168 degrees or whatever for the mash out. And so I can skip that step altogether, stir it up, and then recirculate it or whatever you normally do with your system, and then you're good to go. When they was talking about the conversion of up to 90%, I've done it without this option, and I've had a lot less efficiency.
It's interesting because to me, it always confused me when I've seen that method because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so you're raising this temperature up. By the time you actually gelatinize the rice, you're past, now you denature those enzymes in the barley that you mix in with it, right? So I guess you're getting some along the way, from my understanding, right? And maybe it helps lower the viscosity a little bit before the barley gets destroyed, or the enzymes in the barley, essentially.
Right, because this is going to get boiled. So yes, I understand what you're talking about. But the concern is that I understand what you're saying. The concern is that yes, why am I doing this extra step? It's so that once you get it to your main mash tun, you're not having to mix it all up and volate your water through it and try to get everything going. If it gets all stuck or whatever else, and then it's a mess. This way, you can just put it together, kind of rinse it off, and then you're ready to go because the sugars are already there. It's just an extra. It's a less of a step because you're already adding a step by converting the rice to the gelatinous version of it. Also, though, like I said down there at the bottom, boil for 30 minutes, stirring occasionally to avoid scorching. Definitely I always do this just because I'm paranoid about it. I always taste my rice before I add that mixture to the boil kettle, because if you accidentally scorch your rice on the bottom of your kettle and then you add it to your mash tun, you just added burned flavor to your beer. And unless you're going for a smoked beer, which you could do, it may not turn out well, and you may not really enjoy that flavor in your beer. Just buyer be warned kind of thing. So when to add to your mash. So you're adding, like I said, you're adding potentially a couple gallons of boiling water and rice to your mash. So, and my setup, I have a rim setup where I just put it through the rim system and can crank it up and do my mash out. But when I do this extra step, when I brew with rice, I can simply add this pot to the mash, and it will just kind of skip the whole mash out step. It'll bring it up to about 165 to 175 degrees. And then I transfer that to my boil kettle. So once it becomes this fully gelatinized goo, and it really is that way, You can, if you really wanted to, which I haven't done yet, like you're asking, you can then take this and you could simply strain that and just put that liquid directly into it and not even dealing with rice hulls or dealing with that part of the brew process. So I haven't done that personally. I've just added it all into my main mash tun. If you are brewing on like a single vessel system and you're kind of limited on volume space or anything like that, you have the option to simply get a large strainer, strain out that liquid, and then add that to your main wort. And then, like I said before, I highly recommend using rice hulls to prevent a stuck mash. So in this next picture, you can kind of see that's the black rice lager, and then that's the brown rice lager in the other one that I did. And you can see by it sort of loses it in the picture, but the viscosity of it, just think of it as a very, very thick goo. And I know it's very, very appealing. And then, but the last one I have for you all to try is the brown rice lager that I made. And I went a little overboard. Usually, you do 20 or 30% rice for the adjunct. Well, this one I did 40% because why not? And so the only issue that I ran into with this beer was that it had a lot more protein in it because of using brown rice. So it's still a bit hazy. I was kind of annoyed that even though I added gelatin and had it sitting on the gelatin for 4 days at 34 degrees for a while, it still did not clear up as clean as I wanted it to. But I used the Von Stefan strain on it and fermented it at like 52 degrees for at least 3-4 weeks. And I feel like it turned out really, really nice. But at the same time, this was using 100% brown rice with this beer, but it didn't clear up as pretty as I wanted it to. And I think some of that has to do with just using brown rice. So just FYI, if you use rice like brown rice or a rice like the black rice, it takes a while for the proteins to settle out, even with using gelatin, and it doesn't work as well for cleaning it up. And that was right at 4.2% alcohol. Is what that one finished at. It finished at 10:06. So I know the cereal mash sounded like a pain in the neck, and it didn't sound that much fun. Well, I have good news for you. Do I have to do a cereal mash? You may be asking if you want to brew with rice, and the answer is no, actually. You can use instant rice, like Uncle Ben's or Minute Rice or one of those types of rice. Those rices have already been gelatinized. So the work has already been done for you. So you just simply need to add this rice to your mash like you normally would with a different adjunct. And then the instant rice will absorb a good amount of water, though, so keep that in mind. You may have to add a little bit more water to your volumes just because you may lose a little bit more than you're expecting because it does tend to suck up a little bit of water during it. So I was just kind of curious and looked this up. This is kind of fun is that I noticed that like Minute Rice, they have their traditional white rice, but then they have rice with quinoa, which I haven't done yet. That sounds interesting. And then they have the jasmine rice, and they have brown rice, and they're already pre-gelatinized and already pre-ready to go for you. So if you wanted to try brewing with rice, but you didn't want to do a cereal mash or all these other things, or you weren't able to make it to the brew shop before they closed, and you wanted to brew with rice, you can stop by your local supermarket. Aldi's carries this for way cheaper, just FYI. And you can pick this up there and add this directly into your mash with the rest of your malt, and you're ready to go to brew with rice, which is kind of a fun little thing. So, any questions, comments? Yes, Stan.
Can I just use rice checks?
I'm sorry? Can I just use rice checks? I probably have. You mean like kind of like they do with
Cereal.
like cereal? Well, it's not that kind of cereal, Stan, but you could try it. You know, I remember you did that one presentation on can I ferment that? So I do remember that. So if you want to jump on that one, go for it. I'm curious to try, see how that tastes. But in theory, yeah, you could try that. Probably use Rice Krispies as well. I haven't tried that either. Call it your snap.
Just not Rice Krispie treats, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, you could probably do that in a stout.
I'm sure the yeast would like the additional sugar, yeah.
But the main premise behind this is that I'm going to keep brewing different crazy beers with rice because it's a lot of fun, and I hope that this maybe inspired some of you all to try potentially doing a beer with rice. I feel like we put so much emphasis on yeast, we put so much emphasis on hops and things like that I think it's kind of back to what we're actually fermenting with and how that can change the beer in a dramatic way and really create something that you just can't buy in the store or get at a brewery. Cool.
So there is another beverage that is brewed with rice that we'll cover.
Oh, yeah.
I went too far. So sake. So sake. So sake is a fermented rice beverage, and it's brewed like a beer. A lot of people refer to it as rice wine, but it's brewed just like you would brew a beer. One of the things that makes sake special is that you use a special type of mold or a fungus called koji, which that helps break down the starches in the rice to the sugars that the yeast can eat. And you do this whole parallel fermentation thing. So you're basically adding koji and rice and water at different intervals to basically build up enough sugars in there that you can get a higher ABV beverage out of it. So typically, when you brew sake, it's going to be 15 to 20%, and then it's diluted down afterwards. So with this parallel fermentation, as I said, you can get much higher ABV out of it. Breweries in Japan are called kuras, so throughout this I may refer to a kura, just remember that that is essentially a brewery. And one important thing, it's pronounced sake. There are a lot of different ways to pronounce it. Those are not correct. I have an example here, and hopefully we hear him.
Oh no, I like sake.
Sake.
Especially when it's served at the correct temperature. 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit, like this is.
So it is definitely not sake, it is sake. So let's talk about the 4 main ingredients in sake. And a lot of this is based off of a presentation that my dad Alex and I gave to the club. God, it's been about 5 years now, 2019. So I'm going to go through a lot of these fairly quickly. If you have any questions, please ask. I'll do my best to answer them. So as I said, 4 main ingredients. The first one is obviously rice. Calrose and Yamada Nikishi are the main types. Calrose is actually grown in California and Arkansas. As John was mentioning, Arkansas has a big rice industry there, and a lot of the sake rice that is used throughout the U.S. actually is coming from Arkansas. So the amount of polishing that you do to the rice depends on the grade that the sake ends up being. So if you polish the rice to get to the more starch-dense core and get rid of the outer bran on the outside and some of the stuff that you don't want, that gives you a more polished finish, no pun intended, to the finished sake. So you're going to get more delicate flavors from the rice. Typically, lower grade sakes are the ones that aren't polished as much. So if you're looking for sake, you're going to see Jumai, which I believe is 50% polish, Jumai Jinjo, which is 60, Jumai Dai Jinjo, which I believe is 70. So and those, of course, are going to change in price based on the amount of polishing. Can I get someone to run around and take questions? Mr. Streammeister? Thank you.
So just a few points to add. Junmai actually means Japanese, basically virgin.
Okay.
So a Junmai sake is one that has not had any alcohol added to the fermented product. The Ginjo and Daiginjo refer to the degree of polish on the rice. And I forget the exact number, but one's like 40 or 50, and then one's like another 10 or 20% on top of that.
Cool, thank you.
What what happens when you polish the rice, you're getting rid of any, like you're going into the core of the rice grain, which has much lower protein content. If you brew a sake with rice that isn't polished, you're going to get a very yellow liquor. And that's a bunch of protein that's hanging out in your sake. And that's what they're trying to get rid of when they do all this polishing. And it's phenomenally expensive. So when you go buy your daiginjo, you're looking at 3 to 4, maybe 10x the price of the rot gut stuff that comes in a can with a pop top that you'll see the semi-homeless guy drinking outside the subway station in Tokyo.
And if anybody else has anything to add, I know what I know, and there's a limit to that. So if people know more than I do, please share. I definitely have some holes in my knowledge. So one other important thing about the rice is that the rice is steamed and not cooked. So if you're going to be doing sake, you're going to be doing it in a steamer, like a steamer basket, as opposed to a rice cooker. A lot of times you want as little water absorbed by the rice as possible. So by steaming it, you're going to get some in there, but not a lot. If you cook it in a rice cooker, it's going to absorb more of that water that you don't necessarily want. So koji, so I mentioned that before. Koji is basically a fungus that infects the rice, which starts to convert some of those starches into sugars. There are a couple different types of koji, and we'll talk about some of them later on. Sake is typically made with yellow koji, which is Aspergillus oryzae. White koji, Aspergillus kawachi, and again, I'm probably mispronouncing these horribly, so excuse that. Those are used to do things like ferment soy sauce, miso, rice vinegar, or sochu. And later on in the presentation, one of the beers that I'll share was actually brewed with white koji. So as I mentioned, koji breaks down the starches into sugars. Typically in Japan, when they're making their koji, they have big cedar-lined rooms, and they have basically sacks that have the mold spores in them. So they'll go over to a bunch of rice, and they'll shake this on the rice to infect the rice, and then they'll let it sit for a while. Yeah? You're getting ahead. Yep. You're getting ahead. Yeah. We'll get there. So just like brewing beer, other ingredients, yeast and water, 2 important things. So in terms of yeast, there's 2 typical strains that you use to make sake. And the Brewing Society of Japan assigned some numbers to these when they first categorized them. So you're going to hear yeast number 9 and yeast number 7. So in terms of number 9, both White Labs and Y Yeast have a variant of that you can buy. When we have home brewed sake before, we're using the Y Yeast version. We have brewed with the White Labs version before. What's interesting, though, is we get some banana character out of it, which is very unexpected. It eventually drops out after a year or so, but it's like a banana bomb when you first try it. So there is also sake yeast number 7, which White Labs does carry, but it's not one of their regular strains. It's one of their vault strains, so they don't always have it. We haven't had a chance to brew with that yet. Number 9 ferments at low temperatures, and you're going to get more fragrant aromas from it. And then 7 is real complex and different than 9. And then water. The mineral content of the water plays a large part. Just like in brewing beer, you have breweries that are using natural streams or wells, and that kind of makes their beer their beer. Same thing with sake. So sake cooers in Japan have sources of water that they tap that makes their sake their own. Typically for home brewing, just like we would do in brewing beer, you're going to probably use RO water and then build up your mineral content that you want. It just makes it easier and more consistent on the home brewing level. So let's talk about the brewing process. One thing that is different in terms of brewing sake from brewing beer is you're talking about a long process. So for sake, to have something that is drinkable, well, let me rephrase that. To have something that is something that you would want to drink. You can drink all of it at any point in the process. You probably shouldn't. You're looking at 30 days. There are some additional steps after that 30 days where you're going to be letting it settle out and then racking it several times, and I have that down at the bottom as 4 times over another 30 days. So from start to finish, if you follow every step, you're looking at about 90 days. So it is a much more it is a longer process. Some steps are more involved than others. So I'll just run through this real quickly. There is a nice chart on there that talks about in terms of commercial brewing, but the steps on the left-hand side are more focused on home brewing. So the moto, which is the starter, that's basically your yeast starter. So you're going to start out with a little bit of rice, some koji, and some yeast, and also whatever minerals you're adding to it, yeast nutrient, lactic acid. So that's going to be 8 days. So just like you would do a starter for beer, a moto is a starter for sake. So it's going to be about an 8-day process. Once that's done, Hatsuo is your first edition. So that's going to be your first edition of rice and koji. You're going to add that to your fermenter with your moto. That's going to last for about a day. Then you're going to have your odori, which is your rest. It's also referred to as the dancing ferment. So that's where your fermentation is starting to kick off. And then after that, we're going to start that parallel fermentation that I've mentioned before. So you're going to have your Nakazo edition, which is more rice and koji. And that is day 8, 9, 10. That's day 11. Day 12 is your Tomozo, which is your third edition. So that's your final edition of rice and koji. And then after that, you're going to stir for the next couple days. And that's going to start your Moromi, which is your main fermentation. Lasts about 16 days. And then at that point, you're either going to press. What we've done before is we have basically taken this big, it looks like thin rice pudding. All right, so it's got rice chunks in it. It's very white. We're going to take that. What we've done is we've hung it before. I didn't bring a picture on there, but we basically have taken it, put it into big bags. They're actually paint bags that we've gotten for straining paint at Home Depot. We take them and sterilize them first, of course. But we put this mash in there, twist it tight, and then let it hang over buckets for up to a week, if not longer. You can press it, which we've tried with varying degrees of success to press it. Finding the right press for doing that is hard. We've come up with a few different ways. But just letting it drip and letting it filter itself is kind of the best option. What you have left is essentially lees. It's kind of like a rice mash. People have used that for, you can make different like fermented pickles. You can do different things with that if you want. Once you've collected all the liquid from that, as I said, you're basically going to let it settle because it's still going to be a white, unfiltered sake at that point. If you continue to let it settle, all the material settles down. You rack it to another vessel, let that sit for a while, rack it again because you're still going to have more stuff. Even some of the stuff that we've had that's been a year old, we're still having stuff that settles out. So. And then at that point, you can pasteurize and bottle. We typically leave it as Nama, which is unpasteurized. And basically, there's still some yeast in there working away. Let's go ahead and get I forgot it, Todd. If you can get the big blue bottles. So there were some plastic glasses that were passed around. Those are for sake. If you've used it for beer, Todd will bring some more glasses around, and we'll get some fresh glasses to you.
During the racking on your slide, do you cool it down to help with the settlement, or are you at room temperature at that point?
No. So all of this is basically at the temperature that you'd ferment at. So you're usually in the high 40s to low 50s. So you would keep the sake at that temperature pretty much throughout the whole process. You're still going to have yeast in here, and you're still going to have sugars, so the yeast can still be working. So up until the point you pasteurize, you probably want to make sure that you're still kept at fairly cool temperatures. And we got a mic coming around to you, Patrick.
So my favorite when I go to a sushi place is Nigori sake. How does that fit into all of this?
So Nigori sake would probably be. So we're right around the pressing, so that would probably be after the first pressing, because you don't have chunks in it, but you do still have some matter's probably not the right word to use, but you're still going to have some of the rice material in there. If you were to let that sit, like if you buy a commercial bottle of that and let it sit, you can get clarified sake off the top of it. And actually, if you buy one of those bottles at home, give it a good shake to make sure that you've got everything well integrated on it. Yeah. So that's probably after the first pressing. I wouldn't go any later than that because you're probably not going to have any of that rice in there. That adds sweetness to it. So a Nigori sake is probably going to be more sweet than one that's been filtered or pressed and settled after that. So, Kurt. Oh, I don't know where the microphone went.
So when you use the koji, are you using rice, koji rice, or are you using pure culture of Aspergillus?
So typically what you do is the koji is on the rice. So it's a fine powder on rice already. So that actually helps make up a portion of your rice that you need to use. As I mentioned, in Japan, when they make it up, they do have just the spores that they will use to infect rice that then gets added in as some of their rice addition. So when we get it, we basically get a vacuum-sealed bag of infected rice. It's got a fine powdery coating on the outside of it. Yeah.
Do you know how long that lasts in the fridge?
I don't know off the top. The question was how long the koji lasts. We usually get it fairly quickly. Now, I don't know how long our supplier has it. As long as it's vacuum sealed and kept, it should be okay. I don't necessarily know if there's a lifespan on it. All right, did Todd make it all the way around? Okay. All right, so I'll start talking about, I know the back row still needs to get some. So the sake that we're passing around right now is one of my favorite sakes. If it's on the menu, I am probably ordering this 90% of the time. So this is kikisui. So kikisui is a clean and well-balanced sake, and it's noticeable by the brilliant blue bottle. I don't know if you had a chance to see it while Todd was passing it around. But it's got a real good look to it. So kikisui typically pairs well with anything. It's very, very smooth. It's on the semi-dry side. The chart in the corner was actually from Kikisui's website, so you can see that it's more of a clean, crisp, dry sake, not too high in alcohol. The aroma, you can get orange and persimmon off of it, which, strangely enough, until I read that, I hadn't necessarily picked up on that. But it's definitely there. And I think it's one of those things that if somebody doesn't point it out to you, you may pick up something different. So, yeah. Now, kikisui, usually when it's on a menu, it's going to be served chilled. This is not a sake that you're going to get hot. We'll talk about hot sake in a second. But one of our favorite sushi restaurants that we go to, called Kaito in Encinitas, I highly recommend it if you've never tried it before. They have it on the menu there, and one of the things that they do is they will pour you a glass, but the glass will also be in a box. And unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the box. They do have a picture of it up on one of the other slides. And what they'll do is they'll overflow the glass into the box. So you drink the glass first, then you pour what's left in the box into the glass, and then you drink that. So it's an interesting presentation of it. David, we got a mic coming around you. Masu, thank you.
What's the alcohol level of what we were just drinking?
I believe this was 16. I would need to look at the bottle. $15. I was off. So, and that's something with sake. Sake is going to be up there in percentage. It's going to be 12 to 18, depending on 12 to about 16, 17, depending on what you get. Homebrew sake is a completely different animal, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, so any impressions on the kikisui? How many of you have tried kikisui before? Okay, so a handful of you. I know Jacques has. So what do you guys think who haven't tried it before? Thumbs up from Patrick. 2 thumbs up from Patrick. And Jacques got 1 because he's texting with the other. Cool. All right. So, hot sake. How many people have had hot sake before? Well, don't boo. Like everything, hot sake has a time and a place, right? Usually if it's cold, and you're just, I don't want to say you want to drink more of it, but, if you're looking for, I hate to compare it, but it's probably the Budweiser of sake. It's something, well, but again, time and a place. if you're gonna get $5 carafes of hot sake because it's a deal, well, it's not bad. So, there you go. Yep, and then you have it at the proper temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot sake, typically a winter drink. You can drink it all the time, but it's a cold drink or cold weather drink. Because you've heated it up, any complex flavors and aromas, you're gonna lose them. But typically, that's a lower grade sake to begin with, where you may not have any of that. That's the big bottle of Gekakon. So again, time and a place. There are times and places for that. It's gonna feel like it's much higher in ABV while you're drinking it because the heat, aerosolizes the alcohol to it, and you end up with it in your nose. So it's gonna feel like it's hotter than it probably actually is. So cold sake, like we just had with the kikasuya that got passed around. So cold sake, either filtered or unfiltered, as we mentioned a little bit ago. So the temperature allows more of those complex aromas and flavors to come through that you're going to miss if you heat it. You're going to pick up on all sorts of different things, whether it be fruit, floral, umami flavors, which is in sake, and we will talk about that further in a little bit. You're going to get a crisper body, and it's going to be a more refreshing thing. There are sakes, if you're looking online and, or if you're in a store and you see a brand of sake and you look it up online, usually they're going to give you a chart. They may even sometimes have it on a bottle where it says what's the ideal temperature to drink this at. Keep that in mind because they're going to pretty much know what you're going to have. Some should be chilled, as the kikasuya is, others room temperature, and then others they may recommend hot for it. And I haven't even had a sip of mine yet, so I think I'm going to do that right now. So aging sake. So let's go ahead and get the smaller blue bottle. And remember on this one, let's do small pours because there's only a liter of it. So aged sake. So when we talked about the sake schedule, sake is pretty much ready to drink after the fermentation's complete. After you've racked it and you've got it where you want, and fermentation's done, you can drink it. But age allows a lot of the flavors to mellow. As I mentioned before with the White Labs yeast that ended up tasting like banana, as we aged it, that banana character dropped off. So you're going to end up, it's going to change over time, especially if you leave it Nama and it's unpasteurized. You still got your yeast working on any available sugars that are there, so the character of it is going to change. Long-term aging. So the longer you age something, the longer you age sake, you're going to develop different flavors. The color's going to darken. You're going to end up with an aroma where you're going to have honey. You're going to have very umami flavors like soy sauce or nuts. And I'm going to probably discuss some people, but some aged sakes have a bouillon cube-like note to them. That is the umami that is coming through. So, as you age it and it develops that character, some people like it, some people don't. I like it. So down below, this is a picture that I took at the Iron Chef Morimoto's restaurant in Vegas. I like going there when we're in Vegas. He has a couple different aged sakes. So he has a 5-year aged sake, which for a 2-ounce glass is $27. For a 300 milliliter bottle, that's $171. Going up to a 30-year, and these prices were about 5 years ago, a 30-year aged sake is $107 for a 2-ounce pour and is about $700 for a 300 milliliter bottle, which is about that big. So I did ask the sake sommelier at Morimoto's. For the stuff that he does, it's usually aged in big vessels, big stainless steel vessels. And we'll get to the next slide, which is talking about the aged home. It is actually 30 years. You're right. It is in quotes, but all of these are in quotes. It is actually 30 years. Yeah. Now, Morimoto hasn't had his name on it for 30 years because nobody knew who he was until about the 90s. So, it is probably somebody else's aged sake that he now has his name on. So, yeah. But it is actually aged 1972 sake. Yeah. So aged homebrew sake. So what we're passing around right now, that is homebrewed sake that my dad Alex and I did. So originally, we had brewed this in 2020, January 2020, to bring it to Schiff, bring it to the Southern California Homebrew Festival. We had done that a couple years in the past. It was a big hit. We wanted to do it again. And then COVID happened. So what we ended up doing was we ended up bottling up a lot of it and putting it at the Homebrew Exchange. That was at Andy's house. We probably had 5 or 6 bottles in there. So I don't know if some of you had tried it at that point. Thank you. So we had some left over. And this is what is left of that 2020 batch. There was just over a liter of it. And basically, we've had it stored in mason jars at refrigerator temperatures. So it's been in my fridge for, well, Dad's fridge for a little bit, my fridge for a little bit, for about 5 years now. We're coming up on that. So originally, it was about 18%. But since it's unpasteurized, there's still some sugar in there. I would imagine it's probably closer to 20 now. And Todd, I want to make sure I don't get missed. Because while I did sample it earlier, I would like to have some right now. So this is it. Once this battle's drained, there's no more left of this 2020 batch. That's good. Thank you. So I did share this all with you guys last January to memorialize my reign of terror as president. So you probably remember it from that point. But it's aged for a year and an additional month now. So it's gotten a little more complex in what is there. So what's everybody's impression of this? Patrick? So it's unpasteurized. So there's still yeast in there. Yeah, so there's still yeast and sugar. So it's still working away. So it's probably dried out. I wouldn't say significantly, but it has dried out since then. Kurt? No. No. Oh, yeah, so the question was about oxidation. Are we worried about that? And in this case, no. Probably if we were storing it for longer, we would, but I'm surprised this batch has lasted this long. So, the fact that I still have some after 5 years is quite amazing. Stan?
Okay, so this is somewhat unrelated to the actual sake, but it is related to licensing, and probably Chris might be the only person in the room who knows the answer. So sake is made from 100% grain, but it's typically referred to as rice wine.
Yes.
If you're going to make it commercially, do you need a beer license or a wine license?
Wine license.
A wine license.
Part of doing this was we had investigated, my dad and I had investigated for a while possibly opening up a sake brewery. He has since moved up to Northwest Washington, so that may not happen anytime soon. But when we did look at it, you have to get a wine license. There was a brewery up here in Vista called Kurikali. He brewed beer and he brewed sake also. He had to basically have a bar running down the middle with 2 suites and 2 licenses. The sake could not be served on the beer side. The beer could not be served on the sake side. So, and he ran into a bunch of problems in terms of permitting and licensing for the sake side. The beer side was easy. People open up breweries all the time. They know how to handle that. But when it came to the sake, it was a real pain. So, and you had a question.
Have you ever tried to age it on oak or something else? What would happen? Would it be gross or good?
So we've thought about that before. Our concern with that, and so we have added hops to sake, and we've shared that before. The problem with sake is the flavors are really delicate. So I would be afraid that if you oaked it, even a really small amount is going to completely overwhelm anything else that's there, and then you're just going to get a glass of oak. So it would be a real delicate thing, and it is on our list to try. We just haven't had a chance to yet. So any other questions about this? So if we were to take the price list that I had on the last slide and figure out what the cost of this mason jar of sake is, the street value of that 1 liter is $570.
Thank you.
All right, so now for something completely different. We're going to talk about beer brewed with koji. So one of the things that John talked about was doing a cereal mash.
We have a question.
We have a question.
Guido wants to know what we're paying you for this presentation.
$570. So as John mentioned, you're doing a cereal mash to basically take rice and be able to brew it with beer. So I decided to take a different approach, and I decided to brew it with koji. So the whole point of koji is that you're taking the fungus, and it's basically infecting the rice, converting those starches into sugars that the yeast can then eat. So I figured, well, that cuts a little bit off doing the cereal mash and getting a lot of those sugars out. So I've actually tried this a couple different times. So the first attempt that I've done before is basically doing a moto, which is that starter that I talked about before. So that's your yeast, that's some koji, and that's a very small amount of rice. Building up that yeast culture and then basically using that to pitch into wort. So we've done that before. It's worked with varying levels of success. We found that sometimes fermentation kicks off and goes really well. Other times we found out that it doesn't go at all, so we've had to pitch with something else, which, at that point, what are you really getting out of it? You've still got some koji in there. You've still got some rice, so you're getting a little bit out of it. In this case, we use yellow koji, which is the koji that you would typically use for sake brewing. And as I said, we just pitched it in the wort and let it took over. We are going to attempt that again. I've got some ideas on maybe how to make it a little better. But for the beer that can get passed around right now, Todd, thank you. You're wearing your step counter over there. So how many of you went to HomebrewCon last year? All right, so I was wandering around, and I think it was Lauren, or I don't remember actually who came, Ryan, it was Ryan, came up to me and said, hey, you got to go over and check out More Beer. They've got a beer over there that was brewed with koji, and it's really good. So I went over there and ended up talking to them for a while. They had their representatives from the company that More Beer gets their koji from. So I talked to them. They were serving a Japanese lager with brewed with koji and then a saison. So I was talking to them about the brewing process. They gave me some information. Basically what they're doing is they're adding white koji, which again is the different koji from what you would typically brew sake with. They're adding it to the grist at approximately 10%. Which part of that is lowering the pH, and they say that that helps. You're still getting some of the rice character because the koji is, of course, it's infected on rice. There's a picture of koji in the bag right down there. So you're still getting some rice in there. And then the main benefit is you're getting the koji in there, and you're hoping that the koji is going to start breaking down some of those complex starches. They also mentioned that if you want to do kettle sours, that what you can do is increase that percentage to 20 to 25%. Because it lowers the pH by adding it more, you're getting a lot of acid out of it, so you're able to do some kettle sours and sour things without having to, do it a different way. And one of the nice things is, they were there with More Beer. More Beer sells both types. So if you're interested in doing that, More Beer has both the yellow and the white. The white seems easier to get. They do have the yellow kind of off and on from what I've seen. So, Kurt. Lauren's coming. That's fine. We got a little time to kill. We got to catch up with Todd there.
So, do you know if the koji is actually doing a lactic acid fermentation, or if there's also bacteria in there?
I am unclear on that. I got a little bit of information when I talked to them. I've since tried to research it some, and I haven't found any clear information on that. My understanding, it's coming from the koji and not something else that's there, but some more research needs to be done on that.
What would happen if you were to add another fermentable early in the process, like honey? Add honey to your early fermentation. Would that character carry over into the finished product?
I mean, I would think just like adding it in I'm sorry, just to clarify, are we talking about sake or are we talking about beer in this case?
Talking about sake.
About sake. I don't know. I don't know how sake yeast likes other sugars. It could be that they don't eat them at all. They're just going after what they can get out of the rice. So, which might be what we've seen before when we've tried to pitch a moto into a regular wort, how sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Maybe sake yeast doesn't like beer sugar. I don't know. That's more on the experimental side. So let's talk about the beer that Todd is passing around, since he's got pretty much everybody covered so far. This is called Soji's Koji Saison. So all of my beers are going to have a science fiction spin on the name. Soji is a character from one of the latest Star Trek series, Picard. It rhymed with Koji. I figured it worked perfectly. So this is based on the recipe that I got from the people at More Beer and at HomebrewCon. So as I mentioned, white koji was added to the grist, approximately 10%. I didn't want to only have this much koji left, so it's probably over 10% for this, which ended up being 20 ounces total. I said 7% there, but once I went and recalculated this, it was probably 11 or 12. This was basically a standard Belgian Saison, which is what More Beer and the recipe sheet that they gave me. I basically ordered a Saison kit from them, an all-grain kit, and went off that. So OG was 1081, which was right what this Saison should have been. I used the Lallemand Belle Saison yeast. This thing fermented like crazy and went way beyond what I expected. It finished at 1001. So ABV-wise, it's about 10.5. So I do detect a lot of extra sweetness in there, even though it's a lot lower. So I'm curious what everybody else thinks. I hope I didn't, I hope by saying that I detect sweetness that you guys pick up on something different. So what do you guys think? Brian.
A lot of us agree right here. 10.5%, we did not expect that. That is, I mean, it's pretty dark because Sean pulled up the recipe. So there's a lot of like darker malts in there that are kind of helping that malt backbone. But it's like 10.5. Are you kidding me? That's, I mean, there's dryness to it, but there's definitely a hefty sweetness still remaining from that malt backbone.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is coming from the rice, if there's still some rice in there. Yeah. So one of the things that John mentioned is the gelatinization of the rice. When I, after I went ahead and boiled this and put it in my fermentation vessel, I had, it looked like Jell-O, basically in my kettle. So that was all those starches that gelatinized and then ended up there. So I don't know how much of the sweetness is coming from that, or if it's from something else. I did have a pound of something extra that I threw in, but that shouldn't have changed it a whole lot. I'm just bringing up my recipe here. Yeah, I threw in a pound of caramel malt. It was a bag that we got from HomebrewCon. So I was making sure that my mill was set correctly, so I ran that first, and then I didn't feel like bagging it. I just went ahead and threw it in there. So, any other thoughts on this? Cool. So that brings us to the end. So anybody have any questions that we didn't cover either for John's portion or my portion? Kurt.
I started very feebly playing around with koji rice. I didn't really ever do anything with it. I just bought it. So I had gotten into a discussion with a group of people that ferment things, just things, whatever. And it came up that one of the common things is to just allow koji rice to develop sweetness without ever fermenting it, and eating it as a sweet. And I don't know if that's a typical thing in Japan or not, but people apparently just take the koji rice, hydrate it, let it ferment, and then they eat it as a dessert. It's kind of a gelatinized, sticky, really, really sweet, apparently. I haven't done it. And that's why I asked you how long this stays good for, because I've had it since the pandemic. So
one of the things that I've been itching to try, and I just haven't had the chance yet, is I have heard of people dry aging steaks with koji. So you basically take the koji rice while it's still dry, it's still, dry, grind it up in a blender or a food processor, coat a steak with it, and basically you're simulating dry aging with it. And supposedly it adds a lot of those dry age characters to it without having to wait, 6 months or whatever to dry age a steak, or even longer in some cases. Were there some other questions? Yeah. Oh, we got one over here. We'll get to you in a sec.
So I haven't heard of a dessert per se made with the koji rice product, but there's a drink called amazake, which literally means sweet sake in Japanese, and it's like almost cloyingly sweet. And this is the kind of stuff if you go to the shrine or the temple at New Year's, they'll be handing this stuff out. So it's like it's below zero, it's freezing, it's cold, it's midnight, and you get a cup of this amazake and you drink it, and it's like wonderfully warming and sweet and delicious. I think it's basically like a soup of the sake kasu from the sake fermentation. So it's tremendously sweet. It doesn't have much alcohol because they've already taken the liquor away from it. It might have some trace amounts of alcohol in it, but also they heat it up, so probably it's driven off whatever alcohol was residually left in it.
Thanks. So during the pandemic, I got bored, as many of us did, and I Googled how to make sake at home. What I found was some instructions to basically make white rice, put in some dried yeast balls, and wait. And I gotta say, I mean, it was vinegar. Like, let be number one. I made vinegar. I made some sort of vinegar, but because I'm a stubborn SOB, I drank a little bit of it, and I got a little bit of a buzz about it. Tell me, what did I do?
Well, I mean.
And, by the way, I would like to say my wife advised totally against everything.
So I have seen recipes that advise doing that. I've also seen recipes that say add raisins, because there is some sort of thing that ends up on raisins, some sort of enzyme or fungus or something that kind of acts like koji. Don't follow any of that. So there's a couple good books on brewing sake. There's also a guy out of Oregon, I believe it's homebrewsake.com. I could be wrong on that. But basically, he's the guy that we buy most of our stuff from. He sells the koji, the rice. You can buy the yeast from him also, any of the added nutrients and stuff. He's got a pretty good recipe on his site. But if anyone's interested in brewing sake, let me know. We've been doing this for a little bit now. We've got some knowledge behind it, and we're definitely happy to share. I mean, we could go into all the steps on this, but this would end up being a 3-hour presentation. So, I'm more than happy to share. As for Patrick, what you specifically did wrong, I think it's the recipe. I think it was they were probably trying to accomplish something and only knowing about half the process, and they missed out on a whole bunch of stuff. So that's probably what it was. Well, that was the drinking it part. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, so I also went to HomebrewCon, and I got like 4 or 5 of those little packets, and I haven't done anything with them. So I was gonna maybe brew a beer, and I was curious. I think you said you added it directly to your mash.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you have to like raise the temperature of the mash in that case, if you're just gonna add them directly? And is 4 of those enough to even do anything really?
So I didn't. Their recipe that they had didn't say anything about raising the temperature of the mash at all. I mean, as John was talking about doing a cereal mash or anything like that, this was literally add it as 10% of your grist and mash like normal. So that's what I did. It may be that maybe doing a cereal mash with that does something different. I don't know. This is probably one of those things where a good A/B comparison would be beneficial in this. But because you're doing it at the mash step, it's not like you can brew, get one wort and do two different things to it because you're really doing two completely separate brews. So trying to keep everything equal to test one variable is a little tricky. So.
Okay, thanks. Also, if you were going to add that to the mash and I added rice as well, would that increase the characteristics of?
So I guess one thing that I'm not 100% certain on is what effect does the koji enzyme have to do with converting the rice? I believe it's doing some. So if you add more rice to it, it may go to work on that. But at that point, you may be kind of doing what John's doing, where he's adding it as a cereal mash, even though you may not be doing those same temperatures. So you may still be getting stuff out from that. I'm working under the premise in this case that it's converting, that the koji is actually doing some work. So you may get kind of out of balance if you add more rice than koji. So.
Would you be amenable to doing a collaboration with a local urban winery to make a local sake that could be served commercially?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple sake breweries here in San Diego. Unfortunately, a few of them have closed recently, so there's not very many left. But yeah, I mean, that would definitely be something. If there's somebody that's interested in doing that, I'm more than happy to.
Good.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.